Hello and welcome to today's IC2 Security Briefing. My name is Adrian Davis. I'm the Managing Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa for IC2. Today I'm really pleased to be joined by Richard Cassidy, who we'll be hearing from later. He's from Cyber Reason and he's going to be talking about a very, very topical topic, which is the latest malware trends and attack vectors. But before we hear from Richard, there's a couple of bits and pieces that I must do, one of which is going to be the webinar housekeeping. And first, just introduce IC2. Many of you, of course, will be members, and it's a great pleasure to have you back. And some of our audience today, of course, will be non-members. So it's a real pleasure to have you as well. And just so you understand who we are the world's largest professional body for information security. And our mission and our vision are on the screen now. And I want to draw your attention to the piece here about education. We're about developing and growing our members. We're about educating and helping the wider community understand the sort of things that we do, our roles, our jobs, the problems that we have to face, the problems that we have to solve, the technologies that we use, so that everybody can really understand not only our jobs and our profession, but also understand the contribution we make to businesses, to society, and to our communities. And these webinars are part of that ongoing education piece to really help everybody understand why information or cyber security is so important. As I said, we're the world's largest professional body. How do I know that? Well, we have over 123,000 members worldwide, and we have something approaching 23,000 members in EMEA, and we are growing like mad. We are a thriving community. We regularly exchange views, we regularly meet and discuss our problems and our solutions, and through that we actually push not only ourselves to achieve more, but our profession to be as good as it can be. And how do we do that? Well, we do a number of things. We have member-driven initiatives, and we're behind something called the Global Information Security Workforce Study, which is a document quoted by many governments, that's often quoted in the press, that outlines how many people are needed to work in cybersecurity. And looking forward, by something like 2022, we believe there will be 1.8 million more jobs than there are cybersecurity trained or equipped individuals. So a massive opportunity, but also a massive problem. And coming up in InfoSec Europe, which will be held next week, this is the 2nd of June 2017, so next week starting the 6th of June, we'll actually be revealing the statistics for the EMEA region, not just the global number I've quoted. We also run a lot of secure summits. I was actually in Stockholm for the last 2 days running our Secure Nordics program, and they're a fantastic opportunity for our members and non-members to meet and network and discuss things face to face. We also run local events, which are called chapter events, across our region, and I'm really pleased to announce that we are in the process of forming new chapters across the EMEA region, so we can provide much more local community support, and we can really tailor what we do to the local region. And finally, if you're a member, you have access to a whole range of tools and resources through our member website. So if you are a member, please go visit it. It's continually updating now. There's a lot more there for you. And if you're a non-member, then this is one of the reasons why our members are members, because of the tools and the resources we provide to them to help them, as I said before, grow and develop. So the webinars are part of our education program, as I mentioned before, and we run 5 different types. We interview Chief Information Security Officers, or the equivalent, and we discuss their careers, how they've achieved the role of CISO, what got them into the role of CISO, the skills and the knowledge they need, the tools and the techniques they apply, and how they then grow their teams and individuals to become the CISOs of the future. We have e-summits, where we take a particular topic, let's say forensics or threats and attacks, and have a number of renowned experts come in and discuss different angles, different perspectives around those topics. We also have our think tank roundtables, which are our normal format of an hour, and they're designed to get a couple of experts in the room, and we kick an idea around, we kick a problem around, or we talk about something that's come in the news, so that, again, our members and non-members can get a real understanding of the perspectives around that particular issue. We have our security briefings, which is what we have today, and they're all about individual solutions, individual problems, how technology can be applied, and how vendors and the information security community can work together to solve some of the more pressing challenges that we face. And then finally, we have our ISC Squared EMEA Reacts, and that's where we pick on a particular topic that's very newsworthy, and we try and look at it from a different angle. We looked at the Yahoo breach last year, but we looked at it through the GDPR angle, which was very, very interesting, and actually provided, I think, a lot of learning around GDPR and how it could be applied in practice. Now, the last slide before I hand over to Richard is the housekeeping slide. So we will have a Q&A session after Richard's presentation, so please do type your questions in as we go along. We will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible. The more questions you put in, the better the discussion, so don't hesitate. If you have a question, tap it in, and I, as the moderator, will try and make sure we get through as many as we can. Please do give us feedback. Please rate your experience. Let us know if the topic is right, the speaker is right, the moderator is right. We do value your feedback. It enables us to make this whole webinar series much better for you as an end user. If you are an ISC Squared member and you have registered through BrightTalk and you have entered your ISC Squared membership number, then you will automatically be credited with 1 CPE in 5 business days' time. So today is Friday the 2nd of June, as I mentioned before. It will not hit your account until next Friday. So check in next Friday. If it hasn't been credited, please email my colleague Jack Cowell, as he can provide some of the human magic to make sure it all works. But also, if you haven't included your ISC Squared CPE number in your BrightTalk account, the best thing to do is to take a picture of one of the slides of today and then add it manually into your ISC Squared account. We do have a list of ISC Squared members of all the people who attend, so we can use that as proof of your attendance as well. So if you are looking for CPEs, there are several ways we can help you. Of course, the best one is the automated link. If you have any further questions about the webinar platform or any other problems, please do contact my colleague Jack Cowell. He's currently plugged in listening to us as well. If you have any other problems, the best thing to do is to close down your browser and start again. If you are with us and you're looking for that CPE, the BrightTalk platform is very clever, and it will know how much time you've spent with us, so you will still get your CPE credited. With that, I'm now going to shut up. I'm now going to hand over to Richard from Cybereason, who is going to talk about the latest malware trends and attack vectors. And before he starts, Cybereason have provided us with 2 downloadable documents, which you can find under the attachments and links, the ransomware report and the Cobalt Kitty blog. So please feel free to avail yourself to make use of those resources. With that, Richard, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Adrian, thank you very much indeed, and I just want to extend my welcome to everybody that's joined today. Good morning or good afternoon, and for some of us that probably will be looking at this after the live event, maybe good early morning to you. I can promise you that, over the next 35-40 minutes, I'm going to share some very interesting data with you and really change, if not already, some of your perceptions on really where we're seeing the malware trends going, and really marry that up with some evidence around the attack vectors that we're seeing. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about where I come from and my role at Cybereason. So I'm currently Technical Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa. So I really look after the strategy from a go-to-market enablement perspective. But I've been in the industry for a significant period of time. Over 19 years. I started out in the days of, ASIC accelerated firewalls and VPN encryption, and then joined the UTM wave when it happened, and then jumped into, threat detection in virtualized networks, and have been very, very fortunate to sort of ride various waves of technologies, and spent the last 4 years developing security as a service offerings around public and private cloud, and really heavily involved in global threat intelligence and how that's been morphed through machine learning and applied threat intelligence as a result. So taking that experience here at Cybereason, really part of my job is to look at what's going on in the market generally and help to provide education material, not just to our customers, but of course to the wider industry on what we're seeing and what we think businesses and security experts should be focusing on as they develop their own security architectures and frameworks. So let's jump really into the theme of this presentation, and it's really about those latest malware trends and attack vectors. So I'm going to talk about, it used to be the elephant in the room or the world, but it's not so much anymore. It was thrust to the forefront of our minds if we didn't already know about it through the WannaCrypt and WannaCry attacks, and we'll come onto them more a little bit later. But Vault 7 really changed the threat landscape, and you will know exactly what that's about. And if you don't, I will just give you some high-level stats. It was a huge leak of NSA confidential material, and it included several 100 million lines of code. A total of just shy of 9,000 total files were leaked. And really what that meant in layman's terms was around 1,000 weaponized malware resources. But what was worse about this leak than other leaks that we've seen in the past was these were nation-state weaponized malware resources. And I used to talk, several years ago about less than 1% of organizations should ever see an attack from an advanced persistent threat group or an APT group. And this year that's changed drastically. I don't think that figure is going to be at 1% anymore because of these tools that have been leaked into the general public domain. We're going to be seeing APT, nation-state capable threats, at a rate of absolute knots. And it's going to become a huge problem for organizations, and it already has done, right? We've seen some of those examples recently. And I'm going to talk more about that subject a little bit later on. It affected a huge sort of cross-section of vendors and products. Some of them I've named there. That isn't the exhaustive list. There's a great deal more, and there is more to come, right? So we know that there will be future data dumps from these leaked files and code, and that is just going to feed the zero-day problem that we're already trying to battle relentlessly in the industry. So this has really equipped organizations or actors or groups of actors with tools that would have taken them a significant period of time to build if they took it from scratch and themselves. But we'll give you some analogy on those that still like to do it themselves and why they're still a threat, right? It's not all about ensuring, that you're aware of what is currently out there. It's also about the trends that are happening from the guys that are still writing their own tools and using them in great force. So the challenge we have historically is, and again, this is a message that we're probably all fairly aware of, that the industry is focusing on what's called a wall building methodology, right? So 7% of the spend typically tends to happen on the prevention side, right? So we build endpoint solutions, AV, next gen, gateway security solutions, sandboxes, and we could talk about hundreds of different tools that really are there to keep, putting it simply, the bad guys from getting into our environment. But 100% of the time, they are getting into the environment, right? I mean, there are organizations that have probably yet to be breached, but the reality is it's a matter of when, not if anymore. So what we're seeing is that approach to security overall, whilst it's still incredibly important, right? We can't just say, well, if it's not working, let's remove it. That's not the answer. The answer is using those tools and applying perhaps a different methodology to it. And really, that's the challenge that we face. It's been able to monitor this activity right across what we call the kill chain, or is known as the kill chain, in a way that's much more effective, in a way that is able to respond to these nation-state tools that we're now seeing being used, and in a way that is going to be able to reduce our time to detection. And that's what it's all about. In the security industry, as you well know, we have the good guys on one side of the fence that are trying to reduce the window of vulnerability, right? Get it down to seconds, if not, hit it straight away and reduce it to zero. And then you've got bad guys, if you like, that sit on the other side of the fence that are trying to increase a window of vulnerability. So they've got more time to play and laterally move and exfiltrate data with the organization. And only last year, right, the stats were that it was an average of 208 to 209 days before many organizations in a particular study had even identified that they were breached. And if that wasn't bad, the even more sort of detrimental news was that 2/3 of those organizations were notified by a third party that they'd been breached, and that's really not where we want to be. But the good news is, if we took 2 years before that, it was about 228 days. So by my estimation, and my maths isn't my strongest subject, we're saying by about 2025, 2030, we should have it down to a couple of days. And I know that's a tongue-in-cheek comment. That's not really what we want to be doing. You don't want to be waiting for that list to jump down on that level. We want to make it happen quicker, right? We want to get to that point yesterday and not in 15, 20 years' time. So let's talk a little bit more now about what we've been seeing in terms of the recent breaches and what's been happening in the news. So a lot of these logos you'll certainly have seen, if not heard of, through various resources. We know that WannaCry was a big problem in the UK specifically. It really crippled the NHS, causing all sorts of things to happen, including operations and medical procedures to be put on hold as a result of the breach. I also work part-time in the ambulance service as a paramedic, so I had a lot of friends that I was talking to in various NHS ambulance services, and the knock-on effect to patients needing emergency medical care was absolutely substantial, and the press didn't really do it justice in the fallout that had happened. And this was as a result of a tried and tested methodology in terms of ransomware infection, and we'll come on to how that had proliferated a little bit later on. And then you had a sideline attack that I would like to call it, that happened, in and around the time that WannaCry was pushed out, and that's AdultCuz. And AdultCuz was really a sort of a Monero mining attack, right? It didn't do anything like ransomware did, but it just used the resources of endpoints to mine cryptocurrency. Again, not as nefarious, but certainly had a greater effect, and I'll talk about why that was the case later on. And then there are the ones you probably didn't hear about, right? Because DocuSign were hit only this month, and Google Mail again. And they weren't anything to do with the NSA leaks. They were really down to the tried and tested engineering threats of spear phishing and phishing campaigns. So, big logos are still being hit and in a substantial way, and infrastructure organizations are being hit in a substantial way, all through attacks that we really have seen before, right? Ransomware is nothing new, and cryptocurrency mining is nothing new. So why are we still in a situation where these are getting through the front gates or the side gates or the back doors? This is what this session is about today. It's about understanding how these things happened, and then by dissecting it, putting in place a methodology and a train of thought that really makes us much more effective at preventing this from happening in the future, or if it does happen, containing it far more quickly. So that lends itself nicely to the next slide, which is, if we look at malware trend, what are the techniques, tactics, and procedures that have been historically in use by the underworld, if you like, of cyber threats and bad actor groups? And again, what we try to do is if we marry some of the more popular open source tools to the kill chain, it sort of makes a little bit more sense in terms of how they operate. So, right at the recon stage, tools like Nessus are still fairly strong. Metasploit sits there, of course, as well. You've got Google Docs. If you're not aware of what Google Docs is, it's essentially a database of any publicly facing resource that has been crawled by Google's incredibly impressive web mapping technology, and essentially is a cookbook or a cherry-picked list of vulnerabilities that exist on publicly facing websites and web applications. GitHub, unfortunately, still sits there in the recon phase for bad actors, because a lot of code is uploaded to GitHub, and a lot of that code contains sensitive data, including keys for maybe access to AWS EC2 management consoles, right through to passwords to particular web front ends and management frameworks. And I won't go through all of them because we would spend a lot of time just talking about them, but they're probably some of the key ones in the recon phase. And then infiltration tools, tools like Hydra, right, a lovely automation tool that we still see in use for guessing, billions of combinations of passwords in all manners of formats, without you having to do any work at all. WP scan, SQL map, looking to infiltrate websites by doing all sorts of nefarious activity. And then, typically at the infiltration stage, we still see good and old tried and tested phishing and social engineering campaigns. And what's interesting is typo squatting has seen a resurgence in terms of campaigns that we've been monitoring, looking at across the globe. And for some reason, South America seems to be leading the charge there at the moment. But it's more finance focused. However, that doesn't mean it's limited to finance organizations. And so if we go through the list, and as I said, I want to keep this as brief as I can. These are your tried and tested traditional open source tools that we see in use. So typically a lot of organizations have built fairly good frameworks detecting these types of activities through, signature-based detection at the front end and at the end point, and maybe some level of regular expression, sort of dynamic inspection on that, and then applying machine learning technologies and AI to try to look for some of the more sort of tweaked and nefarious versions of these tools. But, we have a good idea of what we're up against when we talk about open source tools, because they're available to pretty much anybody. However, the industry has changed, and the Vault 7 leak has really taken us to a different phase in cybersecurity overall. So really what the nation state arsenal looked like is completely different to what the open source arsenal looked like from a TTP enablement perspective. And I want to pick on two that I think are very relevant to what's been happening over the past couple of months. So, if we look at some of the key attributes that, were targeted and used in campaigns that have been successful this past while, we can look further into that and say, well, what level of automation was enabled in some of the nation state tools that were leaked recently? And of course, like any good active group, whether you're nation state, whether you're not, you're going to want to automate a lot of what you can do. So the NSA, or I say the NSA, but the group behind that came under a different name, really automated a lot of the particular threats through a tool called FuzzBunch. And FuzzBunch is really a Perl-based exploit automation kit that combines all of the tools that you might be aware of. So Eternal Blue would sit in there, for instance, Eternal Romance, Eskimo Roll, Eternal Champion, and these are all of the what we call the modules that could be loaded and used to target, either to SMB weaknesses or Java-based weaknesses and various others that you can go and do some reading in your spare time on. But what was interesting about FuzzBunch was it was a fully contained launcher, and it still is, right, for these tools. And even if you weren't the most sophisticated attacker, right, let's go pick on the script kiddies for a minute. If you're a script kiddie and you've just got half a clue about security, or you sort of know what an IP address is and what a port is and how to query that data, then you just load this tool. And what's even worse, right, is this tool can be loaded in a Windows command shell. So it makes it even easier, and you could then just give it an IP address, and by the way, if you wanted to know which IPs to go and attack, there's a whole lot of resources out there for publicly available resources that already have these compromises available, and you just let this tool go do its thing, and it would give you the results back, right? It would say that you successfully compromised the exploit, and then it would allow you to move from there. And if that wasn't bad enough, the group behind this automation kit decided to automate the management of that. So if you used FuzzBunch to success, then how about we automate the management of what you've been able to compromise? And that's where Spritz comes in, right? And if you haven't heard about Spritz, I can guarantee you're going to hear about it over the coming months and quarters. And if you haven't heard about FuzzBunch, you will hear about it more over the months and quarters, because it's going to be the toolkit that's responsible for a vast number of breaches that we'll see publicly announced, unfortunately, as we move forward. So this is a Java-based post-exploitation framework tool. So it's basically, if you think about it, it's a remote administration automation persistence tool. And this is quite a clever piece of kit here. I mean, Spritz, once you've successfully compromised your target using the FuzzBunch tool, you've got a tool here that has automated AV detection and avoidance capabilities so that you can be more persistent when your attack is in there. And it's also got a number of tools which are yet to be analyzed in terms of password dumping tools and information gathering tools. And it's all about gaining persistence and doing it in a way that becomes undetectable. So these are going to be some very concerning tools. And, if I were heading up a security department or area within a business, I'd be making absolutely certain that I have the right tools and capabilities in place and the right analyst expertise to fish out that type of activity, this type of automation activity, as best I possibly could. Because as I said, there's still a great deal of leaks to happen, which means there's a number of zero-day threats which will be linked to these tools that we're yet to see across the industry. Now, I'm not here to try to, in any way, give you a doom and gloom message or in any way scare anybody. It's about being realistic in what's happening in the industry. So this is why I'm sharing this type of information, because I think it's important to be aware. And awareness is the first part of resolution, clearly. So let's look at the latest malware trends, right? So we know about where it all sort of started, this new wave of malware attacks and these new types of tools we're seeing. You know, can we look at some attribution around the noisy players at the moment that are using these tools to affect? Well, shadow brokers, we all know about the shadow brokers. You know, they've leaked 5 separate data dumps at the moment. In fact, only 2 days ago, so end of May, if you're looking at this presentation a lot later down the line, they have released a subscription service to the next set of dumps, and they're charging any organization or individual that wants access to these $21,000. And they are promising some very interesting data in these dumps, and they're even saying that there are a number of Windows 10 exploits, zero-day exploits, and some of the latest Windows servers exploits, and a whole host of zero-day threats for other vendors' operating systems that have yet to be released. So this is going to be very interesting. And what we do hope in the industry is that, you know, the good guys subscribe to these dumps, and that Microsoft and Apple and Google and all of the major sort of networking vendors get access to this early on so they can start releasing patches. So shadow brokers have really enabled and underpinned the nation-state capability across the global internet and attack groups, regardless of whether they're sophisticated or unsophisticated. And then I want to talk about probably a less-known group called Ocean Lotus. Now, Ocean Lotus are also known as APT32, and they have been known as APT-C00. Now, these guys appeared back in 2014, and in fact, some reports state them, sort of link them back to a 2013 proliferation. There was a couple of things that happened back in 2013 that they may well be attributed to, but regardless, they became very noisy in 2014. Now, they've been targeting mainly in industry sectors in the Asian markets. However, very recently, they did target a U.S. company, and they've been looking to move their focus. So we're going to see this become much more of a global player. What's interesting about the APT group, and we're going to talk more about one of their campaigns in a few slides' time, is the level of sophistication we're seeing with this group. It is unlike anything we've seen for a long period of time from our own research at Cyber You know, these guys, when they detect that they've been captured or monitored, are pivoting their capabilities almost within a matter of minutes to different attack and threat vectors and exploits. And they seem to be writing their own version of zero-day tools that are doing a phenomenal job of bypassing gateways and AV products on the endpoints and with cross-security infrastructure. But what's interesting about the way they operate is they seem to be fairly sort of online in all of the threats that we've monitored them having access to. So what I mean by that is it's not just a fire a piece of malware, let it beacon back to a C2 location and hope that we get some data that we can resell. They're almost like a pen test security team that are actively engaged in their malware activity. So when they detect something in real time that's happening in terms of detection or sandboxing, they pivot immediately to some other threat vector in the organization. And we're going to pull apart one of the big attacks that we've uncovered and tell you a little bit about how that operates, so you'll get an appreciation for what I'm talking about. So these are the noisy players at the moment. We are going to see others spring up. We already have. But certainly keep your eyes on both of these groups as you start to look to the next couple of months in terms of protection and analysis of what's going on. So really, I've set the scene for, you know, we've got to a point in the industry where we're no longer looking at traditional security threats being the main staple diet of bad actor groups, right? They have been enabled thanks to the leaks of some very capable tools by nation-state groups. They got access to nation-state capabilities. And, how do we know that? What are the indicators of that nation-state activity? Well, let's look at the one that's on everybody's minds at the moment, and that starts clearly with WannaCry. Now, WannaCry is interesting, and I don't want to use this webinar to go into too much detail because it's been out there. We all know about it. We know what happened. We know how it proliferated. But WannaCry used two very key components of the tools that are embedded into FuzzPunch, for instance, called Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar. But what it really did was it leveraged the propagation exploit used by the ransomware quite effectively. It scanned its targets for open ports, SMB ports essentially, and then tried to exploit those ports to a large sort of success. And really from there then use Double Pulsar to be persistent and then to effectively enable the ransomware to behave the way that it did. But this wasn't a difficult attack for the people that perpetrated it, because the tools that they were using, they just weaponized and wrote to enable them to be successful. The R&D time to get to this point was very, very insignificant indeed, which is really the point that I'm trying to get across to you in this session, is that the exploit of itself was something that almost anybody could have used based upon the fact that we knew about these tools several months before. And this is the challenge, right? This is the message here, that we have enabled a vast range of capabilities and expertise to a very sophisticated and unsophisticated market. Operation Cobalt Kitty, as we call it, and these are shared, by the way, as part of the resources in this webinar. So really what this group did, and this is the Ocean Lotus group, was that they essentially created their own zero-day tools. Okay, this wasn't really attributed to what happened with Vault 7, and they used it to steal proprietary information from businesses at the moment in Asia. And what they did was they had a four-phase attack operation in place. Phase 1 was using PowerShell and Cobalt Strike payloads to try to infect servers and systems within the target organizations. But they put a lot of effort into writing the payloads that would infect the endpoint systems. So they used a fileless in-memory payload, and it was based on VBS and PowerShell loaders to do a number of nefarious acts. And then when that happened, they didn't just stop there, because having obfuscated PowerShell access to an organization is typically game over for most companies. You don't really need to go further than that. But these guys wanted to become more persistent, so they created backdoors using DLL hijacking techniques and DNS tunneling, so that they could beacon back to their data mining infrastructure in a way that was very, very hard to detect, because it was tunneling through DNS, for instance. And by hijacking DLLs and morphing those hijacked campaigns in a way to be even more persistent, it was very, very hard to track them down with traditional tools. They just kept changing and adapting the DLLs that they could infect or were infecting to become as stealthy as they possibly could. And then they had another option that they could have used, which they did on a campaign that we tracked, which is an MS Outlook backdoor and a lateral movement spree. So they harvested credentials stored on the compromised machines from the first phase of the attack, and then performed lateral movement and infected new machines with those credentials. So this introduced what we sort of would tell you is a very rare and stealthy technique to communicate with their servers, because they were using Microsoft Outlook to do it, right? So again, they really thought about how they were going to operate and how they were going to be able to adapt their attack methodology. And then you got to the final phase, which was really a new way to reinfect and restore their PowerShell infrastructure. So if you detected that they were using PowerShell to do what they were doing, then typically you shut down PowerShell. But we looked at a particular threat in a particular organization that we were protecting at the time, and they stopped using PowerShell when we detected that they were using PowerShell. And actually, after about 4 weeks, we noticed that they returned to the scene, if you like, and they had a new tool that was aimed at bypassing the security mitigations that we put in place. And this new tool really allowed them to use methods to bypass PowerShell execution restrictions that we put on them. And it's interesting because they wrote completely new tools to do that, and they adapted it from well-known tools that are available on GitHub and really weaponized it in the way that you'd only expect nation-state groups to be able to do. So what this is showing us is that the days of APTs being targeted at a very small percentage of organizations, are over in our estimation. We have seen that through WikiLeaks, through the NSA Vault 7 breach, data leak, that these capabilities are now in the hands of people that really, may not appreciate how powerful and destructive they can be, and if they do, have just been able to automate what would have taken them, several to 9 months, if not more, in R&D to be able to get to that point of maturity. So that's what we're facing as a challenge today, and that's the trend in the latest malware capabilities that we have to be concerned with as security professionals. And look, let's talk about the figures as we stand today. About 2 million devices that have been scanned by an external research group still have this SMB exploit present, right? And I don't have a great deal of information about what IP block that was scanned against. It could have been a particular continent. It may have been all continents. But regardless, 2 million devices that are still compromisable is a potentially big return for any organization that might want to go and do a WannaCry version 2. And then you've got Esteem Audit, right? We're calling this WannaCry again. Esteem Audit is one of those elements that are embedded into the Fuzzbunch tool that is essentially a remote desktop protocol exploit. So it installs an implant for Windows 2003 and XP, which exploits smart card authentication, right? And Microsoft indicated they were not going to patch this exploit because it's too old. Now, I know recently they're rethinking that strategy, and we may find before WannaCry again starts to hit through RDP connections, that it may well be patched. But then if we move away from that and we talk about some of the other elements within the Fuzzbunch toolkit, the other two that you should be concerned about are Englishman's Dentist and Exploding Can. So Englishman's Dentist is, again, a remote exploit against clients running Outlook Web Access or SMTP protocols. And really what it's designed to do is inject and trigger a redirection rule to send mail to another person. So that can support some very advanced phishing campaigns leading to download of nefarious tools or malware kits into the desktops of unscrupulous and unbeknown users. And then you talk about Exploding Can. Exploding Can is a little bit sort of less known in terms of its potential vectors at the moment. But Exploding Can is part of the same toolkit, right? So this is what's interesting. It's not something that people have to go and do research on. If you've got access to the Fuzzbunch tool, Exploding Can is going to be part of that toolkit. And it's another similar exploit that's targeting, older desktops and machines that are out there. And, what's interesting is 7% of desktops still run XP, right? We know that. And if we think about 2003 not being a problem as a server, 18% of the market still operate on Windows Server 2003. So what we're saying is organizations, as much as they may want to get to the latest versions of operating systems to try to get away from these legacy threats that may not be patched in time, really can't. And even if they do, we know from the latest dump that we're expecting to see in the coming weeks, that Windows 10 and the latest server architectures are still a target of those groups, of those exploits as well. So it's a very difficult problem to run away from. As I said, nation-state capabilities are nation-state because they genuinely are much more sophisticated and capable than your typical traditional open source attack tools. So what does that mean overall if we sort of summarize the message that we're really trying to bring to the forefront of people's minds? And it really is talking about evolving your security best practices, and I'm sure this presentation will spark a lot of further interest in terms of some of the points that I've raised, and I hope it does, and please feel free to go and do your research on some of the things that I've talked about. But how do we solve the problem? What are the steps that we can take? And of course, patch management is the top of everybody's list. And, I commented yesterday on a CNBC interview with a well-known threat protection vendor that was berating the industry for allowing patch management to be the reason that a lot of these breaches happen in the first place. I don't think it's fair to say I told you so to any IT security CIO, CISO director of an organization, because the problem fundamentally hasn't been created by those individuals. The problem is underpinned by vendors releasing code that has, exploits available in them. And patch management processes are not easy to solve. We, as organizations, the more mature you are, the more hoops you have to jump through to get those patches out to the desktops. And then there's the whole, attrition rate of who got them, are they on the right versions? It can take 3 to 6 months, genuinely, to get a patch to every endpoint in an organization. So it's not an easy problem to solve. However, we do know from what we've seen in the last 2 months, if we haven't already in the last 20 years, is that we've got to be agile in the way that we do this. We've got to go back to the organizations we represent and look at the patch management process and make sure that it works and that it's agile where it needs to be, and it can still remain in its QA, more sort of elongated distribution model where it can. And then the next point is trust and trust modeling. This is a big point that you're going to hear Gartner and Forrester talking about over the next couple of years. It's becoming a big technology area for organizations, and it's about understanding who you trust, why you trust them, how you model your trust, not just to your users, but to your third-party organizations, and then restricting access to files and resources and networks and segments on the basis of that trust. And I can say in some previous breaches that we've seen over the past 12 months, the damage wouldn't have been, a third, if not, a fifth as bad if they had controlled their identity access management policies and file and user rights management policies a lot better. Because in some cases, when a server or an endpoint was breached, the permissions that resource had was far too great, and it allowed the attacker the ability to bypass the need to inject, pass the hash using LSAS, whatever technique they might want to do to escalate privileges. They didn't need to, because they had enough privileges to laterally move from the endpoint that they had infiltrated. So really getting a handle on our identity access management and user and file rights policies is going to go a long way into containing threats that do breach our security infrastructures. Now, I know continuous monitoring seems like a fairly a simple point to make, but we know that preventing the initial breach is incredibly difficult, if not nigh on impossible these days. So if we're not looking at things from an end-to-end perspective, we're not correlating that data correctly and in real time, we're really going to find dark spots and potential routes of compromise that we're not going to know about until it's too late. And too late in this industry today can be a matter of hours, minutes, forget days. It's much further down in terms of time than it ever has been. And a new wave of security best practices that the industry is starting to adopt, which I think is probably one of the most effective, before I sort of wrap up now, is the threat hunting methodology. So, we know the legacy security stack poses increased risk and exposure because of how it operates. I'm not saying it's ineffective. It operates well for what it does. But we have to take an offensive mindset now to security. We have to build capabilities that actively hunt down zero-day, known bad, unknown bad activity, and consistently hunts for these zero-day threats that we've seen being proliferated over the past while. And that takes a very different approach to security infrastructure modeling than we've probably seen in the past. And it's a new wave of thinking that we really should start to look at and take more seriously. Last on the list, but by no means least, is the user education and awareness piece. I mean, look at Google Mail recently. Let's look at DocuSign. Let's look at some of the ways that some of these tools that were being used by the NSA leaks have propagated. Some of these were spear phishing campaigns and phishing campaign propagation techniques, and that required somebody to click on a link or open an email or download and open an attachment. So if we just, let's get our users educated more now than we ever have before on the right awareness needs when they're dealing in terms of online transactions, and not just in the workplace, but also at home. And really, to finish off, when I say offensive security practices, this is what we do here at Cyberease, and I don't want to make this a company pitch by any stretch. But, what we're saying is, we've got to take the fight back to the attacker. We don't want to be relying on point-based security tools that are reactive in nature, or trying to isolate threats by looking at a particular machine in of itself and not combining all of that data with what's happening right across the infrastructure. So, we've got to be collecting everything that's going on across our servers and desktops. We know that. But really what we've got to do better is relate that data. We've got to connect the dots between what happened on my connection to a website versus anything else that fired across the organization that could be related to some more advanced sort of malware activity, and analyze it in a way that gives us a real-time response, right? We don't want to be churning through gigabytes, terabytes of data and then waiting 4 hours for that output to come back, or even 20 minutes. We want to know in real time where we're seeing unusual activity or trends that either are definitely, malicious operations or could point to something new that we need to look into in more detail. And of course, presented in a way that we can correlate the data very quickly. What I mean by that is not just looking at the attack that you picked up or the unusual activity, but saying as an analyst, hey, where did that start from, and where did it potentially go to? And can I see that now without having to rely on several other tools and manually going in and bringing that data into one interface? And that's what we do here at Cyber Reason at a high level, and this really plays into the offensive cybersecurity hunting methodology that I referred to earlier. So I'm going to hand back to Adrian, of course, and I would like to say thank you very much. I hope you found the subject matter and content interesting, and we'll open up for questions and answers in a moment. But thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was a really good tour of the threats and attacks, and it's nice to see some of the things such as WannaCry put into perhaps a wider context. So thank you very much. We do have some questions and some more are coming in, so I'm going to launch into the Q&A if that's all right. So you talked about threat hunting and you talked about an offensive mindset. This is not the hacking back piece that we've heard people discuss before, but how is this sort of collection and analysis of data different from maybe using SIEM tools or endpoint and gateway solutions? Well, what's the difference?
That's a great question. And the answer, we could spend a long period of time on the ins and outs of the answer, but I'll try to summarize it. SIM technology, right, is not a bad technology. I mean, I've worked with SIM for a significant number of years in significant finance organizations. And, SIM, when you get it right, works very, very well. But the challenge is in getting it right. You've got to correlate the data from across the entire stack of your security infrastructure. You've got to, in many cases, and I know there are some companies offering services to write the rules, but you understand your organization best, and you're writing rules in context of your organization. And if you don't do that well, if you get that process wrong, your SIM doesn't give you the outputs that you really need from an offensive cybersecurity hunting perspective. So the difference between what I'm talking about and what SIM is doing in your traditional security infrastructure, I mean, even if you think about UTM products at the gateway, they're looking at applying AV potentially, deep application code inspection methodologies with traditional signature-based detection at the gateway, and they're looking at point-in-time information. I know some are able to do content inspection across a couple of TCP sessions and monitor over time, but they're typically looking at a single source to a single destination in most cases. And again, however, they're not able to relate a lot of the TTPs that we'll be looking for. They're looking for more known bad and potential indicators of unknown bad. So when we talk about what I'm mentioning, it's really the ability to say, let's forget about trying to look for what we know. Let's create a platform that models the TTPs of bad actors, right? And if we looked at what I talked about when I discussed Cobalt, Kitty, and APT32, and we looked about some of the WannaCry threat vectors. They have very specific TTPs, and regardless of how APT32 tried to morph their activity, we had written a platform that looked for their type of activity. So even if it's a zero-day tool, we knew that they like to communicate in this way. They like to target these endpoints. So threat hunting is more than SIM, because threat hunting is more behavioral analysis based, and it's more about a one-to-many relationship than a one-to-one. And I know there are ways to talk around these points, but fundamentally that's what we're saying is the difference. It's automating that function, and it's taking the onus off the organization to be security experts and allowing true experts to define what we find and how we report it.
Right, an interesting point there, of course, because not every organisation has the expertise or the size of teams to do some of this work. So, Yeah, know when to stop and when to call in the experts, I guess, is another take-home here. One of the other questions that's come out about threat hunting, is it meant to do code replication, input-output fuzzing while monitoring other system resources, or is that a sort of very specific, more so kind of software testing area?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question again. You know, threat hunting needs to take to be effective threat hunting, right? Because that's the key here. Because threat hunting is many different things to many different men and women. But really, true threat hunting and effective threat hunting has to take into account the entire picture. It can't just rely on you know, a connection request to an endpoint on a particular protocol with a known list of vulnerabilities. It has to look at, okay, what was launched on the endpoint? Was it PowerShell? Was it command.exe? Was it a macro running in Excel? Was it a particular web request or a code injection? Was it floating code injection in memory? And then what happened after that? And it's normally the what after monitoring that is where you're going to find the detail of, actually, do I have a problem or don't I? And this is what threat hunting is about. It's about saying, let's note what happened before the event, but let's look at what happened after we saw the breach. And has that PowerShell command or obfuscated code or floating code injection made that client or downloaded a file or performed activity which we know just to be completely and utterly out of character with how we know those endpoints to be operating in this organization to be working? And in most cases, you'll find something that you don't know what it is. You've not seen it before, but you can be pretty sure that you've hit on a zero-day threat, something that's very targeted against your organization. And by the way, if it's something that we know about, then it's going to be even easier to detect because we already have those signatures. So it's about the complete picture, and it's about looking more into, exactly as you said, what's happening at the command line, at the code level, when something gets in through the front gate. It's not just about resources and events. It's about actual monitoring of what's being typed at the endpoint, what's being executed, and how that execution is affecting other devices, if not other processes and files on that system.
Right. So it's the comprehensive overview, isn't it? That's what I'm hearing here. And again, it's a comprehensive overview of things that don't seem right almost.
Correct, and gathering the evidence of what doesn't seem right so that you can say, actually, that isn't right because I can see all of the attributes of this particular threat, rather than just saying, oh, I think this is not right, but I can't tell you any more. That's where sometimes SIM fails, because it doesn't give you that extra context that you needed to grab automatically based upon the initial threat vector.
Excellent. Great answer. Thank you. So sort of moving back to maybe the bigger picture for a second, there's a great question here that says, you know, isn't actually Vault 7 going to kind of give us that disruptive moment? So tech providers will now have to reconsider how they do their production, selling and management of their offerings. Is it that kind of watershed moment where everyone sits up and goes, the way we do stuff has to change?
Yeah, it's a great point, a phenomenally good point. It absolutely has started that wave of disruption that as an industry, we are now going to have to take note of and change the way that we are behaving in terms of security frameworks. It isn't the holy grail. It isn't the silver bullet answer to the problem, because there's a lot we don't know about the Vault 7 data dumps. There's a lot of stuff that's still hidden. There's stuff that shadow brokers said they can't release because it's just too damaging. But if a group like shadow brokers, and we don't know where they come from, right, this is even more concerning, have access to this material, then, you know, at the end of the day, what drives the industry and what drives APT groups, and I'm happy to, you know, to stand by this claim, is money, right? It's a monetization of their activity, and every group has their price. So you can be absolutely certain that these real nefarious tools that shadow brokers have access to are already circulating in the dark web and being used against organizations. So you're right, absolutely Vault 7 has created a shift in thinking, and vendors will stand up and take note. However, the technologies that are best poised today to get you there are those that perform offensive cyber hunting activities in your environment that can seek and destroy this type of activity, then rely on, a particular point in the flow view, which really, as we know, isn't effective anymore. It's not how WannaCry, propagated. It's not how some of the other kits within the Fuzzbunch automation toolkit are propagating. They've got all sorts of vectors they can use. So, a good point, but I'm not saying that it's got us to where we need to be, but it's certainly woken us up to a different approach is needed.
Yes, and I like your comment about the money. One of the speakers at our Secure Nordics in the past couple of days was highlighting the fact that actually WannaCry was a way of manipulating Bitcoin value. For good or for up or down, so that the organisation behind them could actually cash in and make more money out of their bitcoins, which is an interesting point. And actually, that leads us into another question, which is, how soon do you think we will see different versions of WannaCry? Because it was very successful, and obviously, if you look at the Bitcoin values, they rose very quickly after WannaCry. How soon do you think we'll see these new variants of these ransomwares being released?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I tried to touch on potentially one of those vectors earlier on in the slides with a couple of Esteem Audit is, we're looking at this particular module that was released in the dump. I know it's an RDP exploit module, but it may well be one of the bases of the next round of WannaCry type threat activity. You also know, and if you do some homework on this, that the Shadow Brokers Group, or TSB, have said that they have other tools, as I mentioned, that are even more powerful than the threat vectors used in the WannaCry attack campaign. So it is absolutely a case of we are going to see a version 2, and it's not going to be too far into the future. So let's really monitor, what users are opening in terms of emails, if it's a spear phishing type campaign, which is typically how I'd like to operate. And if it isn't, if it's using RDP or even variants of SMB exploits, let's just start to really put the vice down on our gateway infrastructures so that we can mitigate the risk as best as possible. But it's a good question, and absolutely we're going to see something in the not too distant future.
Yeah, very true. And interestingly enough, when you were talking about your kind of top tips, we talked about patch management and everything else. One of the questions is coming saying, what about backups? And is it possible to actually trust our backups to be free of ransomware?
Yeah. So, when I was writing my best practices list, I was thinking I've left out backups. So why have I done that? Look, we should almost say that good backup methodology and strategy is implied. We should be doing that, but you're right. I mean, I've had this conversation toe-to-toe with security experts. Well, look, if we know about the persistency capability of these threat vectors, right? We know that they've been around for many years. I mean, the NSA leaks goes back as far as 2013. So, we're just seeing it really being used over the past sort of 6 months, which means that in our backups, quite clearly, there is going to be code that is sat there that can be called upon at any point. So yes, backups is crucial to perhaps a ransomware mitigation process, but it doesn't mean it's the answer to recovering entirely from a security breach, because in our backups could be unknown tools or malware code. So this is why we've got to take backup as a part of the solution. But the other stuff I talked about around really looking into the data more proactively, more offensive hunting activity, has got to be the only way to weed out these nefarious tools that are already embedded deeply, potentially, into organizations' infrastructures.
Yes, very good point. So again, it comes out to that sort of, you need to have a whole range of responses and not just rely on the silver bullet, which is the theme of your presentation. So we have exactly 2 minutes left. So I need to draw this to a conclusion, unfortunately. You're going to hear back from Richard in a minute because he's going to sum up the presentation and give us a call to action as well. Thank you very much for being with us. We already have some great feedback coming in, so please do keep it coming and use the feedback tab, and do leave any comments that you may wish to as well. So from an IC2 point of view, as a moderator, I'd really like to thank Richard. It's been a really interesting presentation, great Q&A. I'd like to thank everyone who has spent the time the last hour with us. I hope you found it as insightful and as interesting as I have. If you are an IC Squared member, you will get that lovely 1 CPE if you've been with us for 45 minutes. And if you want to contact me to discuss anything about IC Squared, all my details are on the screen, and the link to our IC Squared webinar channel is there as well. This session has been recorded and will be available for replay in about 5 minutes time from the Bright Talk platform. So with that, Richard, I'm going to thank you again and hand over to you for our final closing words.
Thank you. And Adrian, echoing a lot of what you've said, and my appreciation for those that joined today and those that have listened in, after the event was live. The message that I've been trying to get across in this deck is we know that we're in an age of nation-state capabilities now in the hands of a vast range of either sophisticated or unsophisticated bad actor groups or even solo attackers. And let's not rely on our existing security stack to innovate around the revelations of what we've seen out of the NSA leaks. Let's start to take a much more proactive way of really weeding out what we know to be some very capable, malicious, nefarious zero-day tools that have been around for several years within the organizations that we are responsible for protecting or building frameworks around. And let's take the lessons we've learned from WannaCry and the lessons that we've learned from Adulcaz and others that we're going to see in the next couple of weeks to really change the way that we approach security and really detection of malware moving forward. Clearly, the old way is not working. We now have a glimpse into what's to come in the future. We're in a great position as organizations to understand what we've got to build better and stronger. And I don't think it's about better mousetraps. I think it's about a completely different view on how we, as I said, detect and find those new wave of threats and nation-state capabilities that have been released. So thank you very much indeed, and I appreciate your time. I look forward to doing another one in the not too distant future.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Richard. Thank you very much, everybody, and wherever in the world, have a great day, and we look forward to having you on our next webinar. Bye-bye now.